Hi there, this is the second part of the Mount St. Helens video story of Mount St. Helens. And you're going to use this video to conclude the story and also take the remainder of the notes, which you will turn in for points. I'm going to start out the video today with just a really quick review of what you should have recorded in the first video. It would be a good idea as you're listening to this little review to look over your notes and make sure that there wasn't anything that you missed the first time around. So we started out our conversation in the first video by talking about the location of Mount St. Helens. We said it's in Washington State on the west coast of the United States, close to the border of Oregon. We also talked about the general layout of Mount St. Helens and how it's located as a part of a national forest. It is a really rural area, obviously covered over in really thick forest, trees everywhere. That's the main industry in this area is logging and forestry. And we talked about the fact that there were two significant bodies of water that are going to become part of our story. That is Spirit Lake and the two branches of the Tuttle River, which you can see in the picture there. We also discussed the fact that the Mount St. Helens is a part of the Cascade Mountain Range, which is starting in Northern California and stretches all the way up into British Columbia, Canada. And it formed because of a subduction zone situation between Juan de Fuca and the North American plate. We also said that prior to 1980, Mount St. Helens had erupted in the past. The last eruption was back in the 1850s, and it had been somewhere around 120 some odd years since the volcano had been active. So when we're looking at this picture here, it looks kind of pristine and nothing really looks or appears to be wrong. However, prior to this date, May 17th, 1980, there had been quite a bit of activity. Starting back in early March of 1980, there were some pretty sizable earthquakes happening, somewhere between a 4 and 5 on the Richter scale, which you would definitely feel. And those kept increasing by the day. Towards the end of March, they were quite considerable in terms of their number. And so they alerted the proper authorities. Scientists from the United States Geological Survey began pouring into the area with all their equipment and monitoring tools. And they basically set up shop in March to take a look at the volcano. Other things that happened starting in April was the occurrence of little mini eruptions, which you can see happening right here. These mini eruptions would spew small amounts of ash and obviously some poisonous gas associated with those, but they weren't happening with a lot of frequency. They did happen on occasion, but there was certainly more earthquake activity than there were mini eruptions. The thing that started really alarming scientists was the growth of this parasitic dome that was showing up on the north flank of the mountain, which is directly in front of Spirit Lake, or facing towards Spirit Lake, rather. This parasitic dome started to grow, or they noticed it in the beginning of, towards the end of April. And then they kept an eye on it, charting its growth daily. It grew somewhere around 5 feet per day. And when measured in mid-May, it was approaching up to 500 feet from where it had originally started. Keep in mind that these parasitic domes are growing because there is a magma source underneath them, basically formed through a little bit of a weak spot or a leak in the volcano itself. And so essentially it became a ticking time bomb in terms of when the dome was going to open up or fall off or cause a situation. The picture that you see right here is April 27th in 1980. You can see at this point that there is no eruption activity. The earthquake activity had even begun to decrease, and towards the beginning of May, they saw a lot of the earthquake activity dwindling away. However, by this point, they had evacuated the area and created sort of a circular zone of evacuation equally on all sides of the mountain, north, south, west, and east, so that if you were within a certain range and you were in that red danger zone, you weren't allowed to stay. People that were allowed to be in there were scientists such as David Johnston. He was a young geologist with the United States Geological Survey. He was a marathon runner. He was in great shape, and he said that he was hoping that his speed would be able to save him in the event that he was caught off guard by the volcano. However, he did recommend to the local authorities that they change their evacuation plan and expand it so that it contained more of the area north of that parasitic dome, because he had a bad feeling about it based on his previous volcanic research. However, they did not extend that zone, and we're going to find out later what exactly happened with that information. As you can see him right here, he's monitoring the volcano, basically taking size measurements with this, I'm sure, very outdated piece of equipment that he has. And he traveled around in a little camper van, and he's shown on location here, just basically doing what he did best. There's our pictures of Spirit Lake, and then we introduce you, of course, to this character, Harry Truman, which for some reason or another, even though he most definitely was in the red danger zone, he chose to stay put. He basically said if they took him off this mountain, he was going to die anyways. He was in his late 80s, and so I guess back in 1980, they didn't make you evacuate if you didn't want to. So he chose to stay put with his bourbon and his 16 cats. And we're going to learn later on what happened with him. So we get to the point today where you need to start recording details about the eruption day. And the day that everything got bad for Mount St. Helens was on Sunday, May 18th, 1980. Now, we said that the area had been evacuated prior to this, and it had been so for several weeks. People were getting a little tired of being away from their homes. The weather was warming up. This area was very frequented by hikers and outdoors people and people who like to camp and fish and generally just be in nature. And so the weather was forecasted to be absolutely beautiful on this weekend. So a lot of people got tired of playing the waiting game and said, you know what, I'm going to take my chances and venture out. Now, many of these people were lots of miles away from Mount St. Helens, clearly outside of the red zone of danger. So on the day that the eruption happened, lots of people were where they thought that they would be safe. We're going to find here shortly that that caught a lot of people off guard. So what finally triggered the eruption that you see here happened around 8:30 in the morning, and there was a 5.2 magnitude quake recorded on a seismograph. This is all basically the straw that broke the camel's back. This shaking underground was enough to cause that parasitic dome to release. And when we say release, it's caused a landslide, a very rapid landslide, excesses of about 200 miles an hour, where that chunk of rock that had been growing since April literally slid off the side, the north-facing side of the volcano. So there was a gigantic landslide. This exposed the magma that was underneath in the volcano and then proceeded to cause the eruption to happen from there. This landslide eventually wound its way down the mountain and here's just a little view of when that landslide occurred. This is on the north-facing side. And keep in mind, our friend David Johnston was sitting about 6 miles away from the north-facing side in the red zone for sure. And Harry Truman's house, of course, in that Spirit Lake Lodge was even closer than that. As soon as the pyroclastic flow or the parasitic dome had slid down the volcano's flank, now that kind of cleared the way for the eruption to take place. This initiated a series of pyroclastic flows that were speeding down the mountain and flattening pretty much everything in the path. It flattened about 230 square miles of area, and when we say flattened, we mean everything that was standing was pushed down and flat. They equate it to atomic bomb strength in terms of the speed and energy associated with these pyroclastic flows. Because of the fact that there's superheated material in these pyroclastic flat clouds, and these clouds can measure close to 700 degrees in Fahrenheit, it melted a lot of this ice and snow at the very peak of Mount St. Helens. So water was released and started flowing down the sides of the volcano as well. Once you get water mixed in with all of this debris, of course, that is eventually going to wind up in the local waterways. And this is a scene of what we mean by flattened forest. The trees were literally pushed over like toothpicks. Here is the view of Spirit Lake. And unfortunately for Spirit Lake, the height of the Spirit Lake was raised, I believe, somewhere around 150 feet because of the material that was deposited in it. What you're seeing floating there in Spirit Lake is a whole bunch of dead or burnt and stripped trees. And sitting right along the edge of that Spirit Lake, of course, is the lodge of Harry Truman. This lahar that flooded out the lake, and here's another cool little view of that with all of the trees there and the new level of Spirit Lake. The lahar wasn't isolated. It traveled far downstream to the west because of all of the debris that got pushed down in the pyroclastic flows off of the volcano, winding up in the local rivers. This is the Toutle River that we talked about. And here is literally an overpass. This would be like the overpass that goes here from Sunbury into Shamokin Dam. And the water raised so high with so much debris that it pushed bridges apart. It caused a lot of failure in local waterways. So it was a big mess. And this happened for miles and miles and miles away from the volcano itself. They estimate about 46 billion gallons of water, mud, and debris got deposited into the Toutle River. When they took the temperature of the Toutle River a little bit later, they were measuring somewhere around 91 degrees in Fahrenheit. So we know that this would be fatal to most species of animals that are living in there. And it basically was able to spread at around a rate of about 60 miles per hour, where it was traveling to the neighboring towns. Unfortunately for the area, it wasn't just affected by a localized pyroclastic flow or the widespread lahar. Then the volcano started to erupt ash. It now had an open, exposed vent, and there's still a lot of power below the volcano that hadn't been released. And it began to erupt this ash and continued to do so for the next 9 hours. Ash was falling in the amounts of several feet very close to the volcano and obviously extending less outward from there. The ash column extended somewhere around 15 miles up into the air. And like we said before, it continued to do so for hours. Here is a view of a town called Yakima, Washington, which was several miles away, I believe somewhere around the 40-mile mark away from Mount St. Helens. This was a view at about 9:30 in the morning where these ash clouds are rolling in, pushed with the weather currents, and day turned into night. Street lights turned on, insects died, small creatures choked, animals would walk around in the downtown dazed. It was reported that on one farmer's scale, which was designed to measure crops or grain, enough ash fell that it measured over 1,000 pounds. This is a map that shows you the ash fallout in terms of where the ash went from several inches up to trace amounts. By Wednesday, the ash was being recorded on the Atlantic Ocean side, obviously in trace amounts. And it did take several months, but they were able to take samples and detect that it made a lap all the way around the globe and showed up back again on the West Coast several months later. So the ash most definitely entered in the atmosphere and might have played a role in weather for a little while after that fact. This is a view of the zone of devastation. This is the crater that was formed. I think this is particularly crazy to look at how steep and majestic Mount St. Helens was here, and beautiful stratovolcano with that nice snow-capped peak. And after the blast, it literally looks like somebody came along and plucked the top right off of the volcano. It's simply gone. And where all that material went was in the neighboring towns and communities and into the environment. This shows you a little mock-up of where the old summit used to be at approximately 9,700 feet, and now this is its new height. Here are a few damage and destruction pictures. Mainly the cars that you see here were left over at logging camps that were closed. This just shows you the remnants of cars that got caught in the lahars and buried. And then, of course, when the water recedes, they're trapped in all sorts of volcanic ash, which basically cements into rock. There's another view of the car that got, this is long after the fact, but that got crushed in the volcanic lahar. Here's some crazy people that are trying to drive in the volcanic ash, which obviously is no good for any kind of vehicle, with a big ash cloud behind them. To clear the ash, they basically treat it in similar methods to as we clear snow around here. But this guy was not in coronavirus time. He's wearing a mask to protect himself from inhaling the volcanic ash, because if you breathe in those particles, even though they look very small and they're harmless, essentially, you breathe those in your lungs and they're going to start to cause some serious damage. This view right here shows you where the ash, the lahar, was right up to the windows of the house, and then the damage from that after. This one I think is crazy. It has this guy right here that's standing on the new level of the road. Oh, so much material got deposited here that he now is taller than the street sign. This is a view from a logging camp with obviously all of the destroyed forest in the background. Now, I'm sad to report at the end of this that the consequences affected 200 homes, 26 total lakes, 150 miles of streams, 650 miles of road, took out 27 bridges, and lots of railroad were simply either buried or washed away. It's estimated in about 150,000 acre area above ground, the wildlife perished. That is including elk and any large mammals that are there as wildlife. Any kind of burrowing animal, some of those were able to survive. Now, if you look at the picture here, it shows the spots where there are records of either missing people or people that were found dead. You'll notice that where Mount St. Helens is, here is the red zone. This was the zone that was evacuated. These were the areas that they thought would be the most dangerous. And remember, our friend David Johnston said, I think you should expand that red zone to include more of an area north of Mount St. Helens. If they would have done that, a lot of these people may not have ventured into this area and might have had their life spared, because you'll notice that a lot of the deaths were associated with either the Green River up top here or the North Fork of the Tuttle River. Unfortunately, there are 3 little boxes within the red zone that are people that have never been found. They're presumed missing because no dead body was ever recovered. This guy right here, this box right here, represents the box for Harry Truman. Who knows? Maybe he made it to his mine. Most likely not. And at this point, whether he made it to the mine or not, he's not going to be sipping bourbon in there any longer, because he was in his late 80s back in 1980. These 2 right here are for United States Geological Survey workers, David Johnston, and there was another man by the name of Reed Blackburn, who was a photographer that was documenting what was going on there, and both of them were caught in the volcanic eruption. I don't know the story of all of the other missing people or the people that died, but you can see, if you count those up, there are 57 people that are either in that dead or missing category. Here is what Mount St. Helens looks like post-eruption. It basically looks like the surface of the moon, even months and months later. Absolute desolation, no greenery, no animals. This is the Tuttle River Valley post-eruption. This is November. Might be seeing a little bit of signs of life coming on these mountains here, but not much. This is a view of how heavily covered in vegetation. It was pre-eruption here on the left, post-eruption on the right. This is showing you some regrowth, these young trees and where the old dead burnt trees were. And I thought we could end with this current view. This is what Mount St. Helens looks like now, the new elevation of Spirit Lake. And you'll notice in the center, there is a lava dome inside of the crater of Mount St. Helens. So that wraps up our story. You should now be able to have enough information to tell the story of Mount St. Helens pretty accurately on your own. If you missed anything, you can certainly go back and watch the video again to fill in the details. Don't forget to turn those in to get your points.